When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Are you as excited about this episode as I am? I sure hope so. We're about to dive into another story-filled adventure and learn something new. And remember, by learning more about the past, you can make a positive impact on the future. So pack your bags and let's go.
Carved high in the cliffs of South Dakota, you can spot the faces of 4 U.S. presidents. Every year, over 2 million tourists travel to see this famous site. But few visitors know the whole story behind the giant sculpture. It began with one man's dream, and quickly it became a tale of conflict and struggle. By the time the first chisel struck the mountain, the project was already steeped in controversy. It would be a 14-year battle to carve the enormous stone presence. This is the story of Mount Rushmore. It was the summer of 1923. There was a blast in the distance. The ground shook and rocks tumbled down the side of the cliff. A man with a mustache and a brimmed hat looked up at the gray stone before him. Another explosion was heard moments later. Workmen, known as powder monkeys, had laid dynamite up in the mountain. The man took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. His bald head shined in the hot Georgia sunshine. He quickly returned the hat to his head and directed the men to go up the mountain. "Yes, sir, Mr. Borglum," the workmen said as they gathered their tools and climbed to the top. They lowered themselves down the stone face until they were 400 feet above the ground. Mr. Borglum followed the men up. With a chisel in his hand, he began hammering the gray granite into the shape of a human head. What on earth were these men doing? Passers-by wondered. But the reason for their noisy work was quickly discovered. They were carving an enormous sculpture on the side of Stone Mountain in Georgia. When it was finished, the sculpture would be bigger than a football field. The man in the brimmed hat was the lead sculptor of the ambitious project. His name was Gutzen Borglum. He had been hired to design the monument and to see to it that it was completed. It was part of his great plan to create enormous art. "Our age will someday be called the Colossal Age," Borglum declared. "My mission in life is to get people to look at art in a big way and to get away from this petty stuff." While Borglum chiseled away in Georgia, another man named Duane Robinson was sitting in his home in South Dakota. Robinson opened up the newspaper and read the news of Borglum's colossal project at Stone Mountain. It gave him an idea. What if South Dakota had a massive monument of its own? Robinson had moved to South Dakota to be a lawyer and quickly fell in love with the history of his new home. By 1923, he had become the state's official historian. Over the past couple of months, he had been trying to figure out how to get more tourists to South Dakota. The state's beautiful landscape, especially the towering Black Hills, was already attracting visitors, but they didn't stay very long. Would a monument like Stone Mountain encourage the tourists to stay? He thought for a moment about the state's famous Gray Mountains. Could a sculptor carve something into the Black Hills? Robinson wondered. He grabbed a pen and began to write a letter to one of America's most famous sculptors, Lorado Taft. "Mr. Taft," Robinson wrote excitedly, "it has occurred to me that some of our mountains would lend themselves to a massive sculpture, and I write to ask if, in your judgment, human figures might be carved from them. I am thinking of some notable Sioux, such as Red Cloud, who lived and died in the shadow of those peaks." Robinson dreamed of a monument that honored the history of South Dakota, including indigenous American leaders. He waited for a reply. Mr. Taft wrote back. Robinson tore open the letter to read it. He sighed in disappointment. Unfortunately, Taft was in poor health. Robinson would have to find a different sculptor for his colossal project. While Robinson planned his next step, news of his idea quickly spread. Some people agreed that a massive sculpture would bring tourists and money with it. Others, however, were horrified by the idea of cutting into the beautiful mountain. "Leave the Black Hills alone!" they cried. Among those voices were the indigenous people of the land, the Lakota Sioux. To them, the Black Hills were sacred ground. The idea of watching white men chip away at the mountains made their stomachs turn. The Lakota's homeland had already been taken from them many years ago. When gold was discovered in the hills, the area was overrun with miners and businessmen. The U.S. government forced the indigenous people to give up their land. And although Lakota battled to defend their home, they were not able to reclaim it. They listened to the news about Robinson's sculpture with heavy hearts. They hoped it would never come to be. Robinson, however, ignored any words against his scheme. He was now trying to find a sculptor who was willing to take on the huge project. After much debate, he finally wrote a letter to the man who sparked his original idea, Gutzon Borglum. Robinson was perhaps hesitant to contact Borglum. The sculptor had a reputation for being over-the-top, big-headed, and rude. There was also the question of his principles. Borglum's work at Stone Mountain was already steeped in controversy. The sculpture was a memorial to the Confederate leaders of the Civil War. These leaders fought, in part, for their state's rights to allow slavery. Robinson pushed his questions about Borglum's character aside and began writing a letter. "Dear Mr. Borglum," he wrote, "would it be possible for you to design and supervise a massive sculpture in the Black Hills of South Dakota?" Little did Robinson know, this was exactly the kind of project Borglum was looking for. The sculptor read over the letter in delight. He sent a telegram back to Robinson. "Very much interested in your proposal," he wrote. "Great scheme you have. Hold to it." The two men quickly planned a time for Borglum to visit the Black Hills, writing each other back and forth. "He is a wonderful fellow in every direction," Robinson said. But Robinson would later discover that Borglum was not always so wonderful, and the sculptor had his own ideas.
Hi friends, are you enjoying today's episode? I'd like to take a quick break from the story to tell you about another great place to learn about the past. Honest History creates magazines and books for kids that are filled with fun stories and activities that bring history to life. From pirates to spies to great inventions and so much more, you'll learn about interesting people, places, and events from around the world that made history. Created for kids ages 6 through 12, you can sign up and receive new adventures delivered straight to your doorstep every quarter. Just visit honesthistory.co. That's honesthistory.co to sign up today. Oh, and here's a special offer for our podcast listeners. Use code ANYTIMENOW for 10% off. Again, that special code is ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
The train whistled as it pulled into the station. When it came to a stop, Gutzon Borglum stepped off the train and onto the platform below. He had arrived in the small town of Wasta, South Dakota. A man in a dark suit came running up to greet him. "Mr. Borglum," the man said, "I am Duane Robinson." The two men shook hands. Robinson noticed a young boy standing next to him. "This is my son, Lincoln," Borglum said. Robinson nodded to the young boy and asked if they would like to get breakfast while they waited for their next train. Over breakfast, Borglum and Robinson began discussing the project with great excitement. Robinson wanted to show Borglum part of the Black Hills called the Needles. The Needles were towering pillars of granite. Robinson believed that these stone pillars would be the perfect spot for the giant sculpture. As the official historian of South Dakota, Robinson also wanted Borglum to sculpt figures from the state's local history. His idea was to carve the West's great heroes, both American explorers and indigenous American leaders. Borglum shook his head at the idea. "I did not want to say this before, but I don't agree," the sculptor stated. Borglum believed that the sculpture shouldn't be about South Dakota. That was too small for him. No, Instead, he said the sculpture should be about the nation's history. What if, instead, he carved the needles into the shape of American presidents? He took a piece of paper and drew a picture of George Washington, the first president of the United States. He smiled in delight as he looked at his sketch. He believed that he had stumbled onto the perfect idea. "And do not worry about the money," Borglum told Robinson. "It will not be a problem." By now, they had boarded their last train to Rapid City, South Dakota. When they arrived at their final stop, a crowd had gathered to welcome the famed sculptor. Robinson quickly apologized for all the commotion. He had hoped that they could arrive to the city quietly, but Robinson quickly learned that Borglum enjoyed the attention. Eventually, they began their journey toward the Black Hills, over 40 miles outside of the city. They left the paved road and crossed into a bumpy trail, cut out between the tall grass and the green trees. Borglum could spot the gray cliffs in the distance. The next day, the men began climbing the stone hills. Robinson wanted to show Borglum the spot he had in mind for the sculpture. As they climbed, Borglum marveled at the towering peaks around him. When they finally reached the top, Borglum gazed at the trees and the hills in the distance. "Here is the place," he declared. "American history shall march along that skyline." Borglum decided against Robinson's idea to carve the sculpture into the needles. The rock was too fragile. Instead, he found a wall of stone on the side of the mountain. You might recognize the name of this mountain. Today, it's called Mount Rushmore. By now, Borglum had been dismissed from the project at Stone Mountain. This meant his unfinished work at Georgia would be blasted away and the job would be given to another artist. With Stone Mountain behind him, Borglum could dedicate all of his time to Mount Rushmore. After a lot of thinking and planning, Borglum finally settled on 4 people to carve into the mountainside. The Mount Rushmore National Memorial would feature 4 U.S. presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. When people asked him why these 4 presidents, Borglum offered his explanation. "They represent the most important events in the history of the United States," he argued. Borglum soon presented his idea to the U.S. government, and after some convincing, it was finally approved. Robinson worried about the cost of this massive sculpture. How would they find the money to complete it? But again, Borglum told him not to worry. He was confident he could find the funds. Work finally began in 1927, 3 years after Robinson and Borglum first met. Borglum hired a team of men to chip away at the granite cliff. As the rocks tumbled down the mountain, the Lakota Sioux looked on with sadness. To them, the mountain was not called Mount Rushmore, but rather 6 grandfathers, and this sacred mountain was being destroyed before their eyes. They heard the loud bang of explosives in the distance. Borglum's men had laid dynamite between the rocks, blasting away at the chunks of mountainside. Once the smoke cleared, workers climbed 700 stairs to the top. Using cables and hand cranks, they were lowered down the side of the cliff. The men dangled high above the ground, sitting in a seat called a bosun chair. Using a jackhammer, they drilled into the hard granite. Young men and boys, called call boys, sat near the edge of the mountain watching. They would shout messages to each other if they saw anything wrong. When it was safe, call boys ordered the men at the top of the tower to lower the drillers down the mountain. The work was very dangerous, with long hours and low pay. Remarkably, however, no one died while carving Mount Rushmore. But the work on the memorial was also slow and very expensive. Borglum had been wrong. Money would be a problem. Over the next 14 years, he constantly searched for funding. In the end, most of the money came from the U.S. government. Duane Robinson watched the work from afar. He had hoped to be picked for the government commission to oversee the project, but this did not happen. South Dakota has already forgotten that I ever had anything to do with the matter, he said sadly. Mount Rushmore was now in the hands of Gutzon Borglum and the U.S. government. By 1934, the first signs of the monument were taking shape. Borglum revealed the head of George Washington, the first of the 4 presidents. 2 years later, Thomas Jefferson's head was completed, and 1 year after that, he carved the heads of Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. At one point, there was a bill to add a woman's face to the mountainside, the face of women's rights leader Susan B. Anthony. However, Congress said that there would be no changes to the monument. The project was already very expensive and taking far too long. Borglum could finish the 4 heads he had started, and that was it. But Borglum had his own ideas. In 1938, he ordered his workers to begin secretly blasting away rock behind the four heads. Why, you ask? He was creating a hall of records, a secret chamber in Mount Rushmore to store important historical documents like the Constitution. When Congress found out, they ordered him to stop. Still, Borglum hoped to finish Mount Rushmore and its hall of records one day. Unfortunately for Borglum, he would not live to see this. The sculptor passed away in March 1941, and his son, Lincoln, took over the project. According to Borglum's original plan, the sculpture should have depicted the four presidents from head to waist. But, due to a lack of money, only the presidents' heads were completed. Finally, on October 31st, 1941, the Mount Rushmore National Monument was declared done. In the end, it took 14 years and nearly $1 million to carve Mount Rushmore. In today's money, that's over $20 million. Unlike Borglum, Duane Robinson was there to see the completed monument. By then, he was 85 years old. As he looked up the faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, he felt some sense of pride. Granted, it was not the sculpture he had originally dreamed up all those years ago, but it was still quite a sight to behold. The indigenous people of South Dakota, however, saw Mount Rushmore very differently. To them, the sculpture was a powerful reminder of what they had lost. Today, Mount Rushmore remains, not just a monument, but a conversation about history, land, and struggle. What is the whole story behind this famous sculpture, and what does Mount Rushmore mean to different people? As people continue to visit the famous site, these are the important questions to ask.
Welcome back! What did you think of today's adventure? We hope you learned something new. Be sure to share the story with your friends and family, and use what you've learned today to go out there and make a positive impact on history yourself. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about important and amazing stories from the past, be sure to subscribe to Honest History Magazine, where you'll discover stories from around the world. Thanks for listening. This episode was narrated by Randall Lawrence and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Robot Pirate Media. To learn more about Honest History, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media.